Good evening, everyone, and welcome back for take two. The glitches were totally on my end. The minute I clicked the live button somewhere in cyberspace, they did not want us to go live, and my internet crashed. So we are now here for take two. Thank you for coming back. We'll just give it another minute or two for everyone to find us again, and then we will turn the camera over to Chris. She is delving deep. She says she's got 3 pages of notes for the differences between distress ink and distress oxide. She's been playing, she's been researching, she's been experimenting, and at long last, we are back. And Sandy says, not even Friday the 13th. You are right. We got through Friday the 13th. It's now Tuesday the 17th. Maybe it's just, the hangover of Friday the 13th. Anyways, Chris, I am going to let you take the stage and I will mute myself. I am monitoring questions, everyone. So please, please, please ask lots of questions and we will let Chris take things away. All yours, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. Hello, everyone. Yes, it's like being at the airport. You think you're going to get on a plane, and then the next thing you know, your flight's canceled, right? All right, tonight we are going to delve deep into the whole mystery between distress ink and oxide ink, and a little bit about ink in general. So basically, there are 2 kinds of ink. There is dye and pigment. It's the suspensions or the medium that it's mixed into to get it onto your paper that makes the difference. So you have things such as water-based ink, you have oil-based ink, or we call that archival. You have solvent-based ink like StazOn, and they all have their sort of unique qualities in how they react to different things, whether it be water or alcohol or anything that you're using to adjust the surface and the color of the ink. So dye inks themselves, which distress ink is part of that quality, especially the ink one, not so much the oxide, is translucent. So the one that is called distress ink is translucent. So there's a different quality to stamping or using this in coloring paper and doing layering and doing blending, a different quality to this than to the distress oxide. Now, distress oxide is a unique little animal. It is opaque, first of all, and it is a combination of pigment ink with just a little bit of dye ink mixed in. Now, on the books, it says that pigment and dye don't play well together, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that situation with Ranger and Tim Holtz's distress line in a few minutes. So I just want to start off by showing you a little bit of the difference in terms of what we have out there on the market. So we have dye ink, which Concord and Ninth is a dye ink as well. So we have those 2 things. And then we have pigment ink, and I have, I don't know where I got this, probably in a gift baggie or something, but I have, because I don't normally use pigment inks. We have the pigment in distress, but it has a little bit of this in it. And this is Studio G is pigment ink. And then we have a hybrid. So this is similar to what this is, except that this is more of a 50-50 blend of pigment and dye. This is more of a, I'm throwing these figures out. I don't have any exact math on it, but I would say 80-20, 80% pigment and 20% dye. But don't quote me on that. Okay, they all are. What am I trying to say here? So distress is a dye-based ink, The Oxide is pigment based with a little bit of dye-based ink, and these two react to water. And the uniqueness about this is that, technically speaking, reacting to water is going to be more of an absorption factor than a wicking factor. So let me just do a setup. So this is a dye ink. I'm going to put a little bit of, and it's held in a foam pad. You can see the foam here. Whoops. Maybe you can't see the foam. Whoa, it's very bright, isn't it? Anyway, it's very spongy and very full of liquid. The Distress ink pad, on the other hand, is a felt pad. So it has layers and layers of felt where the ink is absorbed into. And let me just put that down there. Now, what you'll notice with regular dye ink versus the Distress dye ink is that the regular dye ink, when you add water, will absorb the water and it lightens it. And I'll dry it so you can see. And when you spray on the Distress ink, the color stays the same, and even the color that runs off it is very highly pigmented. So adding water to Distress ink keeps the pigment very pigmented, and adding water to the dye ink, which is just straight dye, no chemical involved from Ranger, is watering down. And I'm going to dry these because you can see very clearly this hasn't really changed. This, on the other hand, has gone paler. Maybe I'll just suck up a little bit of the water on either side. Always a great opportunity to make another paper towel for your junk journal. Whoops, I put my pinky finger on that one. Okay, let me just tap off some water here and dry that for a second. So this is the distinction between the Distress ink and a regular dye ink, is that the color diminishes on a regular dye ink and kind of blends together. So if I had a different color beside that, the two would merge together. Whereas when you put water on Tim Holtz Distress ink, it wants to wick away. So it doesn't compress and blend, it wants to wick away. So let me see if I can show you the difference in color here. Make sure it's dry enough. So that was the original color. And this is the color with water added. So there is a definite difference in intensity. And do I have a dry spot there? I do. And you can see there is a difference, but it's a much slighter difference in intensity when you add water. And of course, this wicks. So if I wanted to go back in and create a little bubble, I could just go in and pull off more of the color. So I'm actually taking away color, or I can create a wicking situation where that color plays and creates, you know what? My overhead light is not helping me. Do you see how it's changing and modeling the background and making it textured? And if we do that to this previously done ink, it doesn't really change the ink at all. If I could just, unless I pull it off, if I pull it off, I can change the ink, but it doesn't wick. It doesn't have, it needs help to get to that point. All right. Now I'm doing this on texture paper. Maybe I should have done this on watercolor to make it more of an obvious change. So I'll think of that for the next time I do a demo like this. But this is just on regular white heavy stock paper from Tim Holtz. But the color remains basically the same on this one, and the color changes on this one because your ink is staying here. it's wicking away from the sides, but the color doesn't change. In this one, the color does change because it's actually blending together. I'm hoping that makes a little bit of sense. So there's that about them. And then if we look at the hybrid, let me just get a little bit on there. This is pigment and dye. And let's see. So this is a combination of pigment and dye, and I think it has a solvent in it. I couldn't find that information on the internet. And this is straight pigment. Whoa, this stuff is really, you have to push to get this down. You can even see how thick that is. See how thick and shiny that is? So if we add water to this, let's see what we get. So on the combo, the water just absorbed right through the ink into the paper. On the pigment alone, it's sitting on top of it. It doesn't play at all with the water. So that's the difference between pigment, dye, and hybrid. Okay, so this doesn't move at all, but the water does kind of go through. So you would call that sort of like a permanent pigment. And this is why this kind of stuff works well for watercoloring when you're doing stamping. And this just sits on the surface. Now, if I tap off this water, which I'm going to do right now, and I run my finger through it, it's still wet. And wet, I mean still thick and supercharged. And that's part of the problem with pigment dye on their own, is it takes forever for them to dry. So I've taken off the water spots, but you can see that that pigment is still not dried underneath the water, even though the water was sitting on top. Okay, so that's a little bit about the differences in your standard brand. Now we're going to focus more completely on what's going on with these two guides. Let me make sure I covered my notes because I want to make sure you get everything. Yes. All right. So Oxide is a combination of pigment and a little bit of dye ink. And as I said, in reality, pigment and dye ink don't play together well. And the chemist at Ranger found a unique formula where they could put both dye and pigment on the same pad and have them live there so that they would have a unique properties. One is that the two can stay together. The other is that you get an oxiding happening because as it dries, it gets kind of cloudy. The tricky part is in where you can get a mini dye ink with the ink formula. Because these guys fight too much, the smaller the cube gets, the more they want to bounce away from each other. On a cube this side, they can sort of stay suspended without annoying each other. But the smaller that cube gets, the less space they have to sort of spread out and have some space. So they end up pushing each other and they won't stay together. So you won't end up with a consistent color. And if you've ever looked at an oxide reinker that has not been shaken, you'll see 3 layers of color. The top layer is the dye, which is the water reactive part. The center section is that little chemical miracle that they've created, and the bottom is the pigment. So you can actually see the layers in the reinkers of the oxide, which make this possible. All right. I'm not a scientist, so I hope I've been able to explain that in a way that you're now able to understand why you can't get this in a smaller base and why also it has these unique properties. Okay, so let's just talk about distress pads altogether. So both inks are on a felt pad, as I mentioned before. They both are on the exact same pad. There's no difference. there's just a difference in color. And that difference in color comes because of the chemical that is embedded in this to keep the two inks together and to also give that oxidizing principle. So the actual dye ink that's in here and pigment ink that's in here is the same color registration, but because of the way they've been treated, a different chemical here so that it's reactive, and the reactive base as well as the oxidizing base in this one is what changes the color. Okay. Now, what else can I tell you there? So in that, the ink is translucent and the oxide is opaque. The oxide is your best bet if you want to play around with stamping. So stamping a translucent ink onto a piece of paper won't show you very much because you can see right through it. Unless it's a really dark color, you'll have a hard time seeing it on any kind of paper. Whereas because of the oxidizing factor, that chalky effect, this becomes opaque and you can see that color right on where you've stamped. And if you ink your pad aggressively, that's the other thing that you need to remember, that all of the distress line of everything wants you to be aggressive. No little light tapping or little light tapping of your stamp pad. You want to go in there and smush, because the more, well, you don't want to smush so that the ink just runs in between the ridges of your stamp, but you want to, you know, really tap aggressively to the top so that that ink gets all over it and you don't see any bubbles. Okay. You can do that with this, but no matter how much of this you put on, you still have a translucent ink, so it will have no opacity on your paper. This is the way to go for stamping. Okay. Let's see. I told you about the pad sizes and why Oxide is not able to live in a mini. So you'll never, well, when I researched it, Tim Holt says he'll never say never, but it may not be in his lifetime that they can figure that one out. It took 10 years to figure this one out, how to become water reactive. So, you know, it's at least another 10 years or more to figure out how to make that sit in a small container. All right. So dye inks are very impacted by the paper colors that you have underneath them. Less so with the oxide. The oxide side, because of that opacity, you can put on pretty much any paper and it will pretty much hold the same coloring, and I'll show you in a moment. But with the translucent ink especially, it changes color for every paper you use. So I've got a couple of samples here. This one I'm sampling Rustic Wilderness ink and oxide. So I have the ink at the top and the oxide at the bottom. You can see there is a difference in the color of the two because they have this is oxidized because I added some water, and I've got some water. That's water splots, by the way. Okay, I sucked the watercolor out. But if you look very carefully in terms, I've sealed this on one side, and I'll explain that to you later on. But if you look at the base color of this and the base color, oh, this one's better to show you. So the base color of the oxide and the ink are exactly the same base color. So the runoff from the oxide and the runoff from the translucent ink, when I sealed it, are the same. So it's the same color. It's just how the color plays on paper, on color, and with water. Okay. So an example here is like, you can see it looks like oxidizing. It's not. It's the removal of color. So I've removed color in those spots. I've also removed color in these spots. So you can see that the removal of color reacts fairly similar, whereas the oxide has that bluish tinge to it and the ink doesn't. And as I've explained, even though they come from the same color, okay, but one is treated differently than the other. when you look at the colors, let me pull this off so you can see what I'm playing with. When you look at the colors on different substrates, different papers, they make a difference to what you're adding to your inks as well. So I'm just going to close these up so I don't get orange on everything. So here we have 3 different colors of paper, and we have smooth texture here and bumpy texture here, and then we have a porous texture here. So on the smooth paper, I have a yellow based paper. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see the difference in the 2 colors? This is more of an ivory color and this is more of a white. So this is white Tim Holtz. Oops, I'm moving around too much. This is white Tim Holtz heavy stock, and this is mixed media heavy stock, which has the yellower tinge to it. And you can see that the colors react very differently. So the yellow and darker color on this side makes this color darker, even though it's exactly the same ink. It doesn't seem to affect the oxide. The oxide is similar. It's when you get to the translucent that you see the change. And then again, if you add in a darker background and a porous background, you see how porous that is? It's sucked it in so that there's this little bit of graininess to it. So a porous structure and a darker structure not only changes the color again, but it kind of withdraws the color a little bit and lightens it up almost. But then if you look at the bottoms, the oxide is relatively the same. What's going on here is that the paper has sucked in quite a bit of the color, but it hasn't really changed the base color all that much. And then if you add in a porous paper that's white background, but has a texture, you can see the texture sits in the little puddles of the watercolor. This is watercolor paper. Sits in the little puddles and gives you darker areas and lighter areas. And the whites here, so these are both white, but because of all the extra texture and the absorbing of color, the colors change slightly again. Okay, but if you look at the base colors, they're relatively the same. You do get a small amount of texture with the oxides, but the oxides tend to fill the little gaps with the color, but then the color gets oxidized, sorry, at the same rate as the rest of the paper. Now, I'll explain. You'll notice a line down here on all of my papers, and I'll explain what that line is a little later on. It's a tip I have for you. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Another thing that you need to know about mixing color with oxide and ink, you can put ink all over your tablet, but you can't dip this ink pad into another color because it will absorb and mix and blend in to this ink the color that you touch it on. So if this is orange and you put blue down there and you accidentally touched it, you'd end up contaminating the corner. It would now end up dark brown. Okay. Not as much of a problem with Distress Oxide. With Distress Oxide, you can hammer things down any different colors. You can touch this to blue oxide or green oxide. And because of the chalky base, it gives like a protective coating. And all you have to do is just wipe it off with your finger, so it doesn't suck into your pad. So mess around. Don't worry about touching with your oxide. Super careful. Don't touch except when it goes to paper. Like, don't touch the pads to each other. So pad touching not allowed. Pad touching not an issue. I don't suggest you do it over and over and over again if you're not going to clean your pad after each mistake. But that's the basic premise in terms of how to best keep your pads in good condition. All right, here we go. Some demos now. All right. So with the ink, once you've got the ink absorbed into the paper, you can keep watering it. You can keep adding other colors to it. You can muddy it. You can lighten the color using water, and it will continue to react forever until you seal it. With the oxide, the color remains the same, but the process of oxidization continues with the addition of water. And you can oxidize it so that it's almost colorless. However, there is still color there on both of them. The color is underneath the oxidization in this case. And as long as you haven't completely washed the surface and you've done a little drying in between so that the color that you apply with the ink has actually had time to stick into the paper, you can bring back the colors to the forefront. Okay. Okay, so the sealing of this is my hook. Okay, you're going to have to stay to the end to find out what that sneaky bit is that brings out the color and oxidizes oxide, and what keeps the color from continuously reacting in both inks. So you're going to have to hang around to get that tip. So dye inks layer only with the lack of water. Okay, so did you get that? You can only really layer with the lack of water. Otherwise, what you are doing is you're blending. So if you just add water, so imagine that let me try it. Here we go. I'm going to put some ink down here. I'm going to add some water. And I'm going to dip my paper in. Okay. If I don't change any circumstance and I dip my paper in again, I'm just getting the same color and it's still mixing together. And it doesn't matter how many times I dip that paper in or how I dip it in. If I haven't dried it first, those layers are not going to stay. They'll just run off the page. The only way I can get layering to happen is if I dry between each layer. So let me just quickly dry and I'll show what I mean. Now this turned out to be actually quite good. Watercolor paper does absorb, and when it absorbs, it almost dries it. But just take a look at the finished product when I dry it. It's not as interesting as you'd like it to be, I'm sure. I'm just going to pull off a tiny bit here to dry it quicker. And of course, we know that to dry things nicely, you want to dry in the background. Your best results, by the way, will come out of any absorbent paper. So if you're, watercolor paper being a really absorbent paper is where you'll get your best results. Now, it does have texture to it. It's very watery texture. But if you want that speckling, you have to dry to give it the opportunity to add more layers. And then the more layers you add, the better things become. And of course, once you seal it, it becomes even more vivid. I'm going to just tap some of that off. So where we had these watery layers before, we now have these deep and delicious layers happening now. And that's where you want to get to. So in order to get your layers, you need to dry between tappings. Otherwise, you don't get anything. You just get a watery blob of color. And sometimes if you're lucky, like I was using watercolor paper, you can get a little bit of play happening. So I just want to check my notes. Oh yeah, this is looking beautiful. And it's amazing, people. Try just doing one color layering. We're always so concerned about picking the right colors to layer, and we spend less time on just like playing. And look how pretty this paper is turning out, just with one color. So you can go in and continue this process, which I'm going to do just to get rid of the ink, because you know me and ink. And I like to sometimes scrub it because I also like that texture. See the texture that comes with scrubbing? I like that texture. I've never seen Tim scrub, but I'm sure if I showed him how, he would use it.
Chris, if I can interrupt for a second.
Sure.
Alan is coveting your paper towels, so just be warned.
Oh, Helen, you would have to
Created a monster.
I know. And she's not going to get to mine because she doesn't know where I live. So look at how interesting that is now. And you've got some of that scrubbing that I just did on, that you can only do, you can't do it on a smooth surface, but on these woven mats, you can really get a nice texture happening. So try just your plain colors, and that gives you a sense of how everything moves. And then try some with two colors, just so you get the idea of balance, and use your color wheels. Color wheels are great tools. All right, so now what happens with Oxide, I'm just going to do a quick one with Oxide. And I'm going to dry between each one, because we know that if you don't get layers. Or at least I hope you heard that. So I am going to stick this in, and see, I get a nice mush, nice mushy colors. Looks gorgeous. I'm just going to take a little bit off, dry it down, and just show you the difference with what's going on with Oxide. And then it's the marrying of the two, the ink and the Oxide, that gives you the fun play. So Oxide blends together much better. Remember that that ink wants to separate and Oxide wants to blend as well. So you can see that it all kind of mats down and blends together quite nicely. But if you want to have different intensities of your blending, you're going to go in and do your tapping. And every time you add heat or dry to this, whatever was there before is one layer of drying. Now I'm going on 2-layer drying. So the second layer of drying on this makes that even more oxidized. Okay, so you're increasing your level of oxidization every time you build a layer. Now, you have to be careful. You don't want to overwater things in the beginning either. So when you're putting water, you're really just adding one spray. And that is in both cases. Now look at the level of color layering I have there. And then I go in again and just finish it up. So now this is one layer of oxidization. This is the second layer of oxidization. And this is the third layer with oxidization. So this back layer has had 3 levels of oxidization. I know, it's crazy, but it does make a difference to the colors. And if you stick around to the end, I'll show you how to bring these colors out, and it'll blow your mind. And it makes them permanent too. Okay, I am going to do a fun little thing and just take and do some taking away of color, so we have some more fun things going on. Okay, so now look at this piece. Again, one color, several layers of oxidization. So hardly any on the very top, a little bit more on the second layer, and in the back layer, it's like almost white. Although it was lighter than originally. So if you want to look at that piece there, that had more color in it on that first round. So it's really cool what you can do. And so side by side, this is what they look like. Now on white paper, you get your best results with the ink. On white paper, on darker paper like a black or a craft paper, you get your best results with the Oxide. And let me just show you an excellent example of that. So we have this color called Lost Shadow, and I was joking with Darlene earlier today, and I said to her, it's like lost color. It's a minus color to me. So here we have it on the white cardstock, the heavyweight cardstock. So you can see the difference in color, the difference being the oxidization on the bottom, okay? The color pigment is exactly the same, but because of the oxidization, it appears lighter on the bottom. So now you see again the two colors, the difference in colors, because this has the yellowy background. Okay, again, the difference in colors is apparent between this one and this one. And the difference between the whiteness is the oxidization. So where's the color on this one? Oh my goodness, this is a great example about how a light color can be better on a darker paper and how a translucent color just, where did it go? Now, when I sealed it, it still was hard to see on dark paper. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that light colors are not your best bet on dark paper, but the oxide of that color will work, okay? And then this is what happens when you put it on watercolor. It gets stuck in the grooves and darkens up, but not in the Oxide, because the Oxide oxidizes over top of the color, not underneath the color. So you're only going to see the oxided color, not the change in color. All right. I hope I'm explaining this in a way that everybody can. Oh, Alan. Oh, I'm not going to show it to you. All right. So some of the techniques. So the first thing you want to understand is, do you want to blend or do you want to layer? So that's very important. Let's choose a different color. I'm going to pull out some yellowish. This is the mixed media cardstock. So if you want to, if you're blending, you want to wet your surface, okay? Oh, I'm not ready for that one yet. So blending happens when you wet. So you can take a red and a blue. Let's put a little prize ribbon red, a blue, and a little lumberjack plaid on here. I'm just doing a tiny little demo, and I'm going to wet those colors. And when I put them into my mix, I'm blending them together. So you end up with purple, right? So if you're blending, you should always have water to do it. And then I can go in and with my dry pad, add a little bit more. And my wet pad here, I can add a little bit more. And because my paper's wet, I can blend those colors in to each other. Okay? And where they cross over, they create a purple. All right. So that's what blending is. If you want to keep the so you have to keep the surface wet to make sure that the blending is going to happen. As soon as you dry it, the other thing you have to remember is you want to be careful not to, if you're blending, you don't want to blend colors that will end up going to brown. So red and orange is good, yellow and orange is good, but blue and orange is not good because orange is made up of red and red, yellow, and blue make brown. So if you end up with brown on your mat when you're blending colors, just wipe it off. Get it out of there. It's not worth trying to use up that portion of it. If you're like me, collect it on your plate. But you want to avoid brown. So I didn't leave a lot of space between my colors here, but it's best if you leave some good spaces. And if you're not going to leave spaces, make sure that you're using Oxide. So when you touch the colors to the other color, you don't mix the colors, and you can just wipe off the surface of the pad, because as soon as you touch this red onto that blue, you're going to have purple in that corner. Okay, so just keeping that in mind again. All right, now if you want to layer on top of this, so this is all blended together. Do you see how that all nicely blended together? So if we want to layer on top of a blend and you want it to be more aggressive, you do it dry. So I'm going to add a little bit of red there, and I'm just going to tap that in. And now you can see the layering happening. The blendy parts don't happen when you use a dry pat, let's call it. Okay, so blending and layering are two totally different things. It's almost impossible to blend with a blend, or to layer with a blend, as I showed you earlier. It took us a long time to get these guys. We had to dry it and then get the details. So it works the same when you're using color. But what you can do if you want to add a little bit of fun is just put a couple of dots of water in there. And I like to sometimes pull a little bit of the water away. So I have some white halo drops. And let's see what happens. I want to put a little bit, whoops, more on that corner. And let's see what happens when you dry those up. And you don't have to take away the water. I only take away the water when I want it to go kind of whitish. And you notice I haven't done any mixing between the oxide and the ink yet. That's coming. So just for sake of time, you can start to see that the colors blend together because we added water. Remember, water makes them blend. And I've got a purple ring here. And I took the water away from that big one and that little one. And then you've got all these little teeny tiny dots. So you can always make texture using your water as well. All right, where am I? Oh, and you should never double dip. So if you're and the double dipping rule happens when you have multiple colors that could end up in brown. So just keep in mind, to avoid brown, don't double dip if you've got colors on the mat that will blend to brown. And what that is your primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, or any of the secondary colors. So if it's orange, purple, and green. Orange, purple, and green will blend to brown, as well as yellow, blue, and red. Okay. Where am I here? So we talked about playing with different papers, and but what about papers that have pattern in them? Okay, so I've got a couple of pieces of paper here. This has, very hard to see. Oh, there we go. We've got the wood paper and we've got some leather paper. So your ink reacts differently on wood and leather paper too. So let me just play with a whole round of different colors. Get some marine in there. So I'm going to do marine and rustic wilderness Now they're in the same color field, so I'm not as worried about what's going to happen with them when they blend together. One squirch in each. Let's give them a good squirch. So I'm going to stick this in there. I'm going to stick this in there, and then I'm just going to lift up. Okay, I'm going to dry. And then I'm going to do one in Oxide, in leather, so you can see both of them. Okay, that's almost dry. And when you're doing dry, like, don't worry about it if it's a little shiny, because that's okay too. And remember that your inks are going to settle in the grooves of whatever texture you have on your paper. And if you want to heat the back, that's not a bad idea to get things going quicker. And as soon as, I think I've told most of you the tip over time, that if it curls up, just keep drying it, because when it's dry, it will flatten itself out, as you can see here. If you leave it for a minute after drying and you feel the back and it's cool, it means it's still damp inside. If you feel the back and it's room temperature or still slightly warm from drying, then you know it's dry. Okay. And just a couple of more dots because I can. There we go. Okay. And you can see that the color kind of settles into the ridges, and it gives you more detail and brings out the texture of that cardstock. If you remember it before, you can see the texture much better with the ink on it, obviously. All right, now I'm going to try a leather-based one. And we're going to do the combination of Oxide and ink. So I'm going to stick with those colors. I'm going to do ink, Uncharted Mariner, and Oxide, Rustic Wilderness. Whoop! Ooh. And I'm going to scooch just to get me started. There we go. There's my scooch. And I'm going to dry it. And look at the texture that comes out automatically. So this has more surface area for the ink to sit on, whereas this had less surface area for the ink to sit on. So this immediately shows the pattern. So you might want to do less of playing around with it because you want to keep that pattern, right? So we have a lot of water here, so it's settled in. And the amount of water makes a difference too. I think I did less water on this than I did on the other one. And let's scooch that around. Okay, so I'm going to juice this up a bit because I didn't sort of get the effect I was looking for. There we go. Oh, a little bit more in the center there. All right. So this pattern, because I dried the first round of pattern that showed up, it's going to show through the translucent, but not as much through the Oxide. So I use the Oxide on this side and the transparent ink on that side, and you can see that the ink pattern is lifted more, and look how intense you can see the Oxide through there. It's still quite obvious. And then I can go in and just mess it all up and rub and get some texture on those flat surfaces. So now you can see I've scraped texture into that surface to bring that pattern out even more. Just give it a quick dry. And when you look at this, you can see where the oxide is and where the ink is. So when we go to seal this, it'll be interesting to see what pops out of there. All right, now using a blending tool. Here we go, we'll use this. So I use a flat blending tool to blend all my inks. There is a couple of things you need to know about blending sponges. So these blending sponges, which are the Ranger blending sponges, are designed not to hold ink. You can see that I've used this many, many, many times. This is my red sponge. This is what I use for all my pinks and reds. And all I do after each time I use it is I scrub off whatever ink was left there. And it's in the scrubbing that's actually pushed it up to the top here. I've never washed this. You can wash them. Blender sponges are meant to be washed, but they're meant to be washed in cool water, not in hot water, and they're meant to be left to dry naturally. Okay, if you squish them and squeeze them, you're going to affect the felt on the back, and the felt will curl up on itself, and then the sponge becomes over time less useful. So I don't even bother. If I know I have my basic 6, until I've destroyed the surface, I keep using them over and over again. So as I was saying, the blenders are, you're not to expect it to absorb anything. Some of the brushes that are out there, and definitely cosmetic sponges, have an absorption factor, especially the cosmetic sponges. They'll suck in anything because that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to suck in your cosmetic product so that you can smooth it over the surface of your skin. So they would not be the best use of or a best product to use to do blending because you'll get too much dye at one time. Where's my next notes? Oh, we're coming to the end here, folks. So blending can be layered. It does if it's not dark enough. So I see a lot of people forcing ink into here. Force, force, force. It's not going in. I need it to go in, Chris. You don't need to force it. So you start off with the little bit that's on the surface. And when you're doing your blending, you're off the surface, but also at like a 30-degree angle so that you can smooth on to your surface. And you don't get any of the swirl marks when you do that. Okay, if it's not dark enough, you just simply go back, tap your pad, and go back in. Whoops, I went too fast. See? And I was flat. So that lifting it off at that 30-degree angle is super important. Now, with the ink blending, when you get a spot that's darker, it will take you forever, if at all, to get that blended out because every time you go over it, you add more ink to it. So it's getting darker when the area around it's getting darker. So you're never, ever, ever going to be able to get that evened out in a way that you're happy with. However, if you use oxides for blending, now I cannot use the same sponge if I have not cleaned it. If I have cleaned it thoroughly and it's still whitish, then I could switch. But because there's regular ink in here, it's going to affect what happens with my pad when I go to doing the swirling. So I don't want to use the same sponge. So I have a different sponge, littler one. Does make a difference on a matchstick. And again, if you notice, it just sits on top. It's not buried inside. Now you can see right away, I've got some swirl marks there because I intended to make swirl marks, but look at the change in intensity. With the opaqueness of this, it blends much quicker. And I've got some swirl marks here. I can get rid of those. because of the pigment aspect of it, it blends out much easier. And with the oxidization part, it keeps it on the surface. So now that corner, those swirls are almost gone versus what I had here and couldn't get rid of no matter how much ink I put on. All right, so when you're doing blending, it's awesome to blend with the oxides. You can still blend with this, but you have to know that you're going to have to be super careful with it as well. Now, the colors are different. With that thing I'm going to show you at the end, you can make these colors the same. All right. So swirling, blending foams are washable, cold water, dry naturally, or you can just use them rubbing off. So if I want to get rid of that color, I just go to an empty paper towel that is not wet, and I just rub off. The less you put on here and you add layers to here instead, like you tap and add, rather than load this up and try to smoosh it evenly across, then the easier cleanup you have. So as you can see, I had some orange here. I have no more orange left. This is ready to go for whatever orangey color I use. So that's that. All right. So the oxides, I told, oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. We do have a question from Ellen, and I don't know if you're going to cover this in a little bit or not.
Okay.
I'll ask the question and you can say now or later. How do I know when it is time to re-ink my ink pad? Basically, do I know if the problem is me or the ink pad?
Okay. That's a good question because you don't have to re-ink that often. You shouldn't have to. I think that people over ink their pads, and it's because they feel like, well, especially in the distress line, because they feel like they're not getting enough ink on their paper in one swipe. The key to success with the distress line, whether it's the ink or the oxides, is that you layer your color. So you don't need to have a sopping wet pad and a sopping wet sponge to do that. You just need to be able to get enough on there that when you're rubbing it onto your paper and you do 2 or 3 layers, it is the color that you're looking for. Okay, so Ellen, there's no easy answer to that because it's going to be different for every color that you have, from light to medium to dark. Dark, you will probably notice it more quickly. Medium, you probably won't notice it even when it probably should be done because it's a more average color. And light, you probably won't even notice it at all. And you'll probably think to yourself, oh, I haven't inked that in a year. I maybe should give it a bit of an inking. Or if absolutely nothing is coming off it, then you know for sure you have to ink. But for me, it's all about how it lays on the paper. Let me see if I can do a demo. I'm going to get some of the ink off of this. So you can't even see any ink coming off that anymore. If I'm rubbing on my paper and I'm getting nothing, obviously I'm going to change it. If I'm rubbing on my paper and all I'm getting is that, very scratchy looking, and even though I'm coming off and holding my thing at a 30-degree angle, but it's all scratchy, I might resort to either refreshing or to adding a re-inker. So refreshing, let's talk about refreshing quickly. Refreshing is only if your pad is dry, bone dry. You forgot about that color. It was left in the bottom of a cupboard and the heater was on all winter, and you open it up in January and you run your finger across and absolutely nothing comes off. That's bone dry. That's when you refresh, because what you have to do is condition the pad to receive more ink. So you got to do the refresh first. let it sit for 24 hours, and then you can add the re-inker, because otherwise, if it's a dry pad, it will not take the re-inker evenly. So you really want to make sure that your pad is moist with the refresher, has had that 24 hours to settle so that it goes through all those layers of felt, and then you can re-ink it and it will draw the ink into all those layers of felt, and you will have an even surface again. Okay, that was just a quickie. I wasn't even going to talk about that one, but there you go. All right. Did I answer your question, Ellen? I hope.
I think you're good.
Or bring the ink pad to the PCWER. No, you can do this. I can trust you. All right, so oxides give you more coverage, as I showed you there when you're blending. For those that don't like the haze, again, I'll show you how to get rid of that at the end of the live. Oxides are better for clear embossing. So if you're doing stamping to clear emboss and you want color to come through it, the distress embossing powders react very differently than clear embossing on distress colors. So first of all, you do not distress emboss with clear on an ink, because the ink doesn't show up as well. You won't get your true color because, as we talked about before, it's translucent. If you want to have an embossing from Uncharted Mariner that isn't a distress embossed surface like the embossing powder, and you want it to be in a clear surface that is nice and smooth and shiny and no little divots in whatever the distress activity is in their embossing powders, then you would use clear that you love on top of the stamped oxide. So oxide, because of that pigment, gives you a better stamped image, and that goes for also for embossing. So you just stamp it like you would your stays on, or not stays on, your totally out of my brain, but you know, your embossing stamp pad. You do it the same, but you do it with a distress oxide. Sprinkle your glitter on it and then heat it, and it will be fine. What else do I have here? Just make sure I cover everything. Oh, when you're doing the embossing, and this is just general for embossing in general, always lift one side of the paper so that the heat can get nicely through the paper, and your embossing will be much cleaner, much smoother in surface. It doesn't apply, and it also goes quicker as well. So finally, all reinkers can be used as watercolors. Doesn't matter whether it's distress oxide or distress ink. Their qualities will still show through if you watercolor with them. So you're going to get your oxidization on the watercolor. You can still bring out the true colors of these with my special little thing I'm going to add at the end, that takes away that oxidization if you don't like that as much. All you do is put a drop of whatever colors you want into a lidded watercolor tray, and you're lidding it because you don't want to spill it, not because you don't want it to dry out. It doesn't matter if it dries out, it won't, but it doesn't matter if it dries out because all you have to do is reactivate it with water, right? Because they're water-based products. And always remember that the oxide might need a bit of stirring, because in that little tiny tray, it could, the reinker could separate. So you want to make sure you just stir that with a little stir stick before you start using it to watercolor, to make sure you get the true mix of color and oxide together. Okay. All right. So now the trick to making things beautiful and keeping them permanent. So let's go back to a couple of things we have here. You're going to say, oh, but I knew about that, Chris. You knew about it, but you didn't know how wonderful it is. So I'm sure you've all heard about distress glaze. Okay, I use my flat daubers. Let me get that out of the way. And the one thing I'm pretty sure you don't know is you always have to keep the lid on this distress glaze. Even though it looks like Vaseline, it's got a solvent in it. And once the solvent disappears, the whole thing will disappear in your bottle. It just retracts into a gummy little mess at the bottom. So you need to always make sure you have your distress lid on your glaze so it doesn't dry out. So what I do, you can see the shape of my distress is the shape of my dauber. And I just go in there and squeeze a little bit off. A little bit goes a long way. And I tamp a little bit so that I get a very thin coat on here. All right. So this has both distress and I'm just going to do one side so you can see it. Now with the textured paper, you really got to work it a little bit more than you would normally have to work it to get it into the grooves, and it's a little bit harder to see on the distress. But know that if you cover the whole area with the glaze, it will not react to water. So I'm going to let this dry for a minute, and then we're going to spray this with water so you can see the difference. Now, this is Oxide. You can see the oxidey haze. This is regular. I shouldn't say regular. Oops, I already have some here. I just about overdid it. So again, making sure you cover nicely. I'm doing 1/2. And I'm also going to do 1/2 of here. Now it doesn't show up as much when it's all one color, but we'll get to the mixed colored one in a moment. So if you add it to both your distress and your oxide, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a line down the center. This side shows more of the orange color. This still has a lot of oxidization. This is actually where you can see it quite well because this is ink and this is oxidization and it's all the same puddle. So do you see how it brings out the color and kind of diminishes that haze? However, it's still a very different color blend than what we have here on the ink. So you still get a little bit of that oxidization, but it brings up that color that's hidden under that oxide. And with the regular ink, what it does is seal it, of course, so it's not reactive anymore. And it also will punch the color up, okay? And this one was just plain, and this one we're going to do one side.
Chris, Margaret is asking if the glaze dries shiny or matte.
It's matte. It's a matte glaze. Whoops. Now this one's going to be tricky because I got to get... And there is an awful lot in here. So you want to make sure you don't overglaze, because you overglaze, what happens is it feels sticky and it takes a longer time to dry. So it's hard to see that. Yeah, it's hard to see in this one. But what it will do is seal everything off. Now here we've got some multiple colors. I hope this will show. So I'm going to bring my camera down very low. And I'm going to turn down some lights because I think I'm washing out the color a tiny bit. Actually, whoa, there we go. All right. So I'm just going to get a bit more on. And it just, what it does is it punches up those colors. And if your colors are dry, it doesn't take any color away. It just covers and punches up the color. I'm looking at the camera. Does that look punched? I can't tell. It looks punched from my side. I hope you can see the punchiness of it. And it seals it. So let's do an experiment with water right now so I can prove to you that it's waterproof and it doesn't reactivate. So here is the plain ink. I'm going to spritz it with water. First of all, what happens? You get bubbles on one side and water that's activating everything on the other side. None of this is moving. All that's there is water droplets. So I can tap this. All right, whoops, I got some on there. And none of that has been affected. Whereas this is still all dribbly. Okay. And let's do this guy. This has got oxide and regular. I think this one does. All right. Again, we got water droplets. I don't know what side I did. Oh, I need more water to get it moving. It doesn't want to move. Sorry, my camera's... Oh, I did that whole side. You see how I have water droplets all along that side? But this side is all watery and it's moving the color around. Okay, so this glaze is super important, and if you want anything to have longevity, you can see the difference in the paper. One side is soaking wet and the other one is dry. Let's try this one. Again, right away the water starts moving that blue, and over here nothing is moving. You've got those water drops. So it's super important. And this one, what is cool is it won't even affect the hazing you have here, whereas this side, every time I add water and dry it, it goes lighter and whiter and whiter. And unless I put that glaze over top, it will continue to oxidize until the color disappears. And that is every time I've added water, not heat. It's all about water. So if you can see right now, look how oxidized that is now. And this side, no change. Okay, so even if you don't, if you love your stuff, basically what I'm saying is, if you love your stuff and you want to keep it from oxidizing and you like it the way it is at the moment that you're finished, you need to seal it or it will have a life of its own. Okay. And of course,
sorry,
yeah,
I have a question.
Yes.
That area that is glazed, could you now put other layers of color over top, or will it resist the ink?
It'll resist the ink. But what you can do is stamp. If you have a permanent, remember that the opposite kind of ink will work with the opposite kind of ink. So we have water-based inks here. So you could put like an archival stamp on top of this. Because archival is pigment based, right? And oil pigment based. And that's why it works with watercolor markers and watercoloring. So you could put that on top of there easily, but it will reject water. It's mostly just to prevent whatever's underneath from becoming a hot mess. You can still see that oxidizing now. And this guy is still nice and crispy. Anyway, that's all the fun. Oh, let's see what happens here. Look at those beads. We like the beads. That's my new thing. Love the beads. And there we go. And our guy is all good. And like I said, I can stamp over him with an archival ink or a stays-on ink or something that has a different base, that's not a watercolor base. That's it for me, folks. I wanted to give you a quick review. So what did we learn tonight? We learned that ink and oxide are reactive to water. They have different properties, but the same color when sealed with glaze. Okay, so you can see the color more truly when it's sealed with glaze. They can be stamped, blended, watered, and mixed into and with anything, and stenciled. So you can mix these inks in with any of um, your pastes, and it'll change the color of the paste to the color of your ink, and you can stencil them, you can paint with them, you can splot it on, do whatever you like. They can be made permanent or left to live a life of freedom. That means if you don't seal it, obviously, whatever happens to it, happens to it, and you have to be okay with that. Um, they are my favorite ink, folks. I don't have much of anything else. If I have anything else, it's because somebody gave it to me, and I hate having things thrown out. So I always rescue, as you know, about the tissue and the paper towels and everything else. So I have a new appreciation of Oxide, by the way. Can I just add that? Because I am an ink user, always have been an ink user, and it was good for me to do this exhaustive study, and I hope I get a Pulitzer Prize for it. And I found out things that I actually quite like about the Oxide now. So I'm very inspired. I hope you are too. And I'm done.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was an excellent, excellent review and demonstration of the two different types of inks. And I guess the bottom line is for people to just go home and dig out what they have and play with them to see what they will do.
That's right. Always, with anything you buy.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you again, everyone. We will sign off for the evening. Thank you for your patience with the technology issues off the top. And thank you for sticking with us till the end. And Chris's number one tip, the distress glaze. And we'll see you tomorrow night for What's New. Have a good night, everyone.